Hi, good evening everyone. My name is Ita. I'm happy to be moderating tonight's panel discussion with a very distinguished panel. Of course, you know, the US-China geostrategic rivalry is the most consequential relationship of our lifetime. It's beyond, implications go beyond the traditional diplomatic tensions. It is about, technological competition, the quest for technological supremacy. It's also about the competition for the future of global governance. There's profound implications for businesses, for governments. We're already seeing this playing out across different industries in the space that in the industry that I work for, in telecommunications. We see it spreading out across AI developments, realignment of supply chains for equipment. So these are very real things that are panning out in the entire landscape. And what makes this entire geostrategic competition very complex is the asymmetric nature of things. You have two superpowers, two different political systems, two economic models, yet they are all closely intertwined and interconnected through trade and technology. Well, given all these complexities, tonight we're very privileged to have this panel who will help us unveil beyond what you see on newspaper headlines, and help us better understand the strategic calculations behind what America is doing, what China is doing, and discuss potential pathways forward. So without further ado, I just want to start off with the first question, which is what is the current state of the US-China relationship? Are we in the stage where it's Cold War 2.0? Is there zero room for optimism in this US-China relationship, or is there still room for cooperation? Would any of you like to start first?
I suppose I'm getting arrowed because I am an American, first of all. So I need to state that up front so you know if there's any biases, that's where it's coming from. I represent the American Chamber of Commerce. We represent the voice of nearly 700 member companies, American business interests, and so I do hear from a lot of people who have their concerns about a number of different things, by the way. The US is not just about their relationship with US and China. As you've seen in the news, the tariff situation is not just about China. President Trump has a list of countries that he is considering and leveraging tariffs on, Singapore being one of them, unfortunately, since there is a free trade agreement, and yet Singapore has been asked to pay 10% tariff. So that's something that the Chamber has provided feedback on, particularly using the fact that there has been a free trade agreement, there's a trade surplus with the United States. So we are asking for the administration's consideration when it comes to any discussions regarding tariffs and Singapore. Back to US and China. I'm not trying to avoid the question, I swear. Look, there is a relationship, clearly. President Trump, depending on the day, wants some kind of relationship, whether it's adversarial or whether it's collaborative. And the truth is, for the time being, the two economies are intertwined. And the American businesses that I represent that require materials from China, that do business in China, cannot afford for there to be any kind of disruption in their business relationship. So clearly they've been making adjustments. When on any given day, when President Trump says we don't want so much to do with China, we need to become more independent, that is taken more seriously. However, if you take the example of rare earths, almost primarily that has been coming out of China. So there is no way that businesses can completely disconnect from China. We can talk about de-risking, however, whatever that means. The fact is that US and China have a relationship. And how that is defined is primarily between two individuals, the United States President and the leader of China, Xi Jinping. And depending on how they choose to proceed, it does not matter, at least on the US side, and I believe so on the China side, it does not matter what the cabinet of the United States thinks, what the Secretary of State thinks, it does not matter. It only matters what President Trump thinks and what he feels like doing. So on that front, we do need to observe him very carefully, understand his mentality. Someone just told me that, and by the way, has anybody read Art of the Deal? That is about Trump, President Trump's way when he was a real estate mogul in New York, how he would negotiate with people. He wrote it with a ghostwriter. And I'll tell you something funny about this book, because this year I pledged to use the library more. So I said, I'm gonna borrow the book from the library. It's called Art of the Deal. And people told me, you gotta read it if you wanna understand his approach to deal making. So, okay. So I have 2 library cards. One is in California, where I'm from, so Santa Clara County Library, and my other library card is here, NLB. So I go to Santa Clara Library and I try to borrow the book there first because you can read it on your Kindle. No books available. There's like a wait list of like 60 people. So I was like, oh shoot, I'm never gonna be able to read this book. Don't worry, NLB, many copies. Nobody wanna read it. Yeah, so if you wanna read it, you can easily read it if you borrow it from NLB, which I did. And it is through this book that you understand that he has no respect for people who just bend over. He has no respect for people for when he goes and says, I want this, and they go, okay. He doesn't like it. And so this person told me, look at China. China's actually doing really well in the tariff negotiations because they will not give in. They're giving him a hard time. They're earning his respect. And I do believe that there is some merit to that approach in that he wants a good negotiation. He enjoys it, and he has more respect for you when you don't just give up. So that's the nature, I believe, of the current US-China relationship. It's a lot of, it's not just adversarial, it's also a bit of enjoyment in that negotiation and that hunt for a good deal. So, not all is lost.
All right. Bernard or Prof, would you like to respond?
Yeah, I think it's actually US-China is now having selective engagement. So, it's a shift. I have read about that selective engagement which occurred. In the past, we see that US-China around the WTO session, and I saw full engagement. And now there's just another extreme that where they try to, in fact, the reality is they narrow down their engagement even for area like security and weapons, it's clearly down. That reflects the issue about, on one hand, we see the decoupling, the US side and China saying that anti-containment. So in reality, the link is less than before. And also, we like to see parallel systems, or if you think about technology platforms, even you have I joined another event 2 days ago on similar topic, and one of the challenge we face that the speakers cannot work on the same platform for obvious reasons. So, so that's an obvious reason even for joining an online platform is so difficult. There's a lot of other things. Another side, as you mentioned earlier, there's a link. We cannot acknowledge like rare earths, like another results, AI chips, and others in reality. So we like to see a kind of reduced fuel dependent, and I think that's something that's maybe opportunities, also challenges for countries outside these 2 major economies. So that's talking about looking at right?
So I'm Singaporean working for a French company, so my views will be very objective, right? So I think a few points I'll make. The first one is like there are comparisons between whether we are in a Cold War or not, but I would just point out the main differences between Russia and China is that China is a lot more integrated in the global economic system compared to 40 years ago, compared to Russia. So it means that any US-China rivalry is going to have a big impact, which is why we are seeing, and the 2 panelists also alluded to, is that the negotiation is taking place. Donald Trump has given another 90 days extension, and China is the only one that received another 90 days extension. The rest of us, we receive either a love letter or just a edit posted on the White House website, and that's it. So you can see how important China is to the whole world as well as to the US in terms of their businesses and inputs and so on. But of course, the changes in the environment has changed so much. It depends on what industry you work for. Just to give you a story, just yesterday I met up with a Southeast Asian petrochemical company, And we are asking them, so are you worried about tariffs impacting your businesses? And they said that not really. Mainly it is because in fact, it gives them advantage. Why? Because when they sell into the US market, they no longer compete as fiercely with the Chinese competitors, because now with the tariffs still in place, 55% or up to 55%, they become more competitive. So it works out for them. What they are worried is if whether their buyers is going to be able to absorb the impact from tariffs. So there are risks, maybe not from the main business, but from other parts of it, which is why they talk to us, because they are trying to diversify the risk away. I know you have a question on the implication for businesses, but this is just a story to tell you, because your question is really a big question. The state of the US-China situation, how is it impacting us? I would say that it's going to, compared to, let's say, the first Trump administration, is of course a lot more serious now, because just for my company, in the US, we need to be careful with how we talk in our economic presentation. You can't even say, or at least the communication team advised us, please just say President Trump and not just Trump. So there are changes in this communication, and being an economist based in Asia for close to 20 years, I never thought I would see a day where I need to be careful with what I say in the US.
Thank you. So it looks like generally, I think there's a cautious sense of optimism about how the direction of this US and China relationship is evolving. But just a follow-up question. Now, we spoke about the current situation, and we want to talk about the future. So in this game, in this competition between China and America, the scoreboard is always changing, and the rules are up for debate, right? So what sort of, then the question really is, will this ever end? What does an end game look like for China and America? Or what does a win look like for either of this party? Would any of you like to, crystal ball and look into the future? What do we expect? What can we expect? What an end game looks like? I think this question has not been really discussed anywhere else. I thought we should explore this.
Well, I feel like the end game is pretty clear for the United States, because the perception of President Trump is that we have been disadvantaged by a world of globalism. Globalization, free trade has disadvantaged the American worker, and we lost jobs in manufacturing, which means those who don't have a college degree have no jobs. And so the end game would be, number one, reindustrialization, right? Bring manufacturing back, which then will create jobs. That's debatable because manufacturing has changed so much over the years with the automation and all of that, that we don't know if those, primarily men, by the way, I'm sorry to say, whether those who are displaced, who don't have jobs, will be able to get the kind of good paying jobs that they did back in the day, right? We're talking like maybe 50, 60 years ago, And so one scenario is you bring back manufacturing, you will then have more good jobs for those who didn't go to college, and so you will have a rising middle class. That's one scenario. The other one is, of course, technological dominance, right? No reliance on outside of the United States. American companies have invested and been first movers on AI. They continue to spend billions of money into AI, and I know China has a different strategy on that. However, it's about technological dominance, either in technology or in my field, healthcare. When you talk about mRNA vaccines, when you talk about genomics, remember, I'm a genetic epidemiologist. The United States was the first to sequence the human genome. So all of those things, we want to own that back. We don't want to share it with the rest of the world. What's to say with the cheap shopping and all that kind of stuff? Well, do you really need to be buying all this cheap crap? Maybe not. So I don't know, that's an end game. However, the dominance of the US market and consumer power and all of that, that's what President Trump wants to see. He wants to see the United States enjoy the good life again, which means lots of jobs for everybody and leadership across all sectors, including in particular, I think, technology, defense, and possibly healthcare.
And would you want to attempt, the question of whether China really aspires to be number one?
I think actually, for the end game, I don't have a crystal ball, but I think that's actually both sides will claim the win or get the win-win outcome, or they are good deal for them. But if we look at the phase one agreements, back in 2020, one example, although it differs from nowadays, I have to say, we don't have those AI waves time. They are, given the short time of negotiation, difficulty and sensitivities of those kind of issues, they like to reach a shorter agreement instead of a deep, for long-term solution, and which is also very difficult if you think about issues ranging from industry policy to other areas, AI or export control, many of them. So the United States was in the short, like to have a short solution. And also, if you look at phase one example, which is like to continue to be the case, that the implementation itself is interesting. If you look at phase one agreements, they rely on unilateral, measures, but you don't have a third party, in that regard. So with enforcement, it's also been interesting to observe what happened. I'd like to have more adjustment in the process to reach the equilibrium between two of them, and so we'd like to see more dynamic outcome in the years to come instead of stay, one side fits the all for whatever time we are talking about.
So there is a saying in economics, right? I think Keynes is that in the long run we are all dead. So I think that the end game is going to be a very long drawn. I don't know, it will be 50 years or 100 years, but and I agree with what Professor Wang said about the sort of both sides may claim the win, that they win to some extent, and you can see whether in practical terms when President Trump wants to attract investments in the country, it's not as simple as just companies investing X amount of dollars. If you look at TSMC, they pledge a certain amount of dollars, but they have trouble hiring because there is a talent shortage there. And when Coface clients, we ask them, so how do you deal with the tariff? And they say that, no problem, they have production capacity within the US. And we ask them, do you hire a lot of people there? They say no, their factories are highly automated, so they hire a very minimum number of people. So this tells you that even if you are able to get an investment package, it may not necessarily translate into a lot of jobs for Americans. And then that will just perpetuate the problem that they are facing now, which is the pushback against globalization, not filtering down the benefits to the people in terms of jobs, the white collar, the people in the Midwest, and so on. So I will say that it's very hard to claim a win on this side, but they will do it from a maybe from a PR optics kind of angle.
So I just wanted to ask a more maybe provocative or sensitive question. I think Lei Hsien, you mentioned about America's quest to continue to remain dominant, to be number one. But in its quest to maintain status quo and be number one, it has actually changed rules, upended the entire global order, whatever that's agreed in all the different multilateral organizations, WTO, all the different tariffs and all. But it has changed the rules of the game. Historically, it has always been the up and coming power that seeks to upend the global order. People used to think that China is that so-called revisionist power. But it seems like America is the one that is changing all the rules, the rules of the game, just to be number one. What do you think about it?
Yes, sorry. I first of all,
I just wanted to,
I know you're trying to be provocative, but I don't think that these things are happening because just to be number one, right? There are a number of reasons that these things are happening, and part of it is a bit of outrage, okay? So, because we've had countries, and because you're talking about US, China, and I am American, so just remember my bias. We believe that China, because they have not been following the rules, and America has been trying to uphold the rules to no avail, that it's time for us to stop being nice, right? There needs to be some correction, and if nobody else is going to correct them and push back, then we need to do it finally. So that's one thing, and it's not just to be number one. If you think of it in that way, it's also how do we make this fair? How do we make sure that we don't get taken advantage of as America just because we've been the world's #1 economy and we've been very generous after World War II. We helped to set up Japan again and support Europe. Why do we gotta do all the work? When are you all gonna step up and contribute and take on ownership over the problems in your own country, right? So that's one mindset. The other thing I should also point out is, being American, I have family in the US. I have personally not lived in the US for a super long time, but I am very patriotic, in case you haven't noticed. And I think a lot about, as an American, how can I support my own country? And in that sense, I don't believe I'm that different from President Trump. It's just that his approach may not be the same as mine, right? That whole thing that we all laugh at, MAGA, make America great again, make America healthy again. If you strip away everything and just think about those 4 letters, 4 words, it's not a bad thing when you're a citizen of that country. Singapore also wants Singapore to be great, and Singapore also wants to protect its citizens' health. And it's just a matter of approach. So to some extent, he doesn't really care what you all do outside of the United States. He really is focused on what's happening domestically, and it just so happens that domestic issues are linked to international issues, so you gotta do something about that, right? So I don't want people to think that it's all, people in the room, maybe we all think about politics and geopolitics and international trade and relations. Americans don't think that way. They're thinking about what's in their backyard. They're thinking about local politics, who's gonna protect public transportation, get the homeless off the streets. By the way, I'm from California too. So we got a lot to think about. You think we're really thinking about you all the time? Sorry to say, no.
Would you like to respond? Or add on? Okay, go ahead.
So I think one thing about the US-led world order is that I think historically there are 2 reasons why they want to underwrite the world order after World War II. The first one is, of course, the access to energy, especially from the Middle East. Second one is really it's more like an ideological battle in the politics, right? Democracy versus communism. The third one is more to prevent maybe the spread of nuclear warheads and proliferation. And 2 of these 3 reasons has really fallen, right? Because the US is now sufficient in terms of energy with the fracking, the shale energy, and so on. Second part is that communism, or at least the Russian communism, has fallen since the fall of the USSR. And now US is spending a lot of money on interest payment. In fact, I think it's about the same as almost their defense spending as a share of GDP. So they are thinking, why should I be there are no more reasons for me to underwrite the world order, so why should I be bearing the cost of it? And it's about time to think for ourselves. If you look at it from that perspective, then you know that this is more of a structural change. I would say that even if the next president comes in, be it from the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, I don't think fundamental trend for that US-China rivalry or US pulling back is going to change fundamentally.
Fair enough, yeah.
I think one thing is that they are saying that all politics is local. So that may help explain make one solution earlier. And 2 is actually that for globalization, without see a kind of deglobalization, I think some dynamics. Because one of the reasons for that, globalization brings benefits. Obviously, import products is cheaper, but on the other side, those have impact on the local industry. As one example, I'm in the free trade agreements. I work on trade. You see, looking for free trade agreements, usually get more attention to tariff costs instead of how do you support, the affected industry. It's not only like US, but whatever country work down the card. So that was one of the challenges that if the underlying issue had to be addressed, there could be some of the pushback. Certainly, I think we see a lot of challenges for multinational, because in the past, the rules like WTO has been, something back in gas 1947. So that's about 80 or plus years. Hasn't really been substantially updated until nowadays. Because WTO was not really able to push through new rules. However, you have a much more complicated area. Technology, government, and many numerous others. So you see a mismatch between the multilateral mechanism and the need. So that's really explain many reasons why we see a lot of shit in that regard.
Yeah, so I think that nicely dovetails into the next part of our conversation. I think we want to focus on the implications on businesses. And on your point about tariffs, I think we are seeing tariffs, I've lost track of how much tariffs is being taxed on each country because it keeps changing over the past couple of months since Liberation Day. So under such an environment, there's no regulatory certainty, there's no, consistency, clarity. These used to be the rules of the game, but it has all changed. So how can businesses, respond in such an environment? What should businesses do in this current state of flux? How do you advise your clients?
So for us, one key thing that we have been doing, and this is even before this tariff policy happens, even well before COVID happens, is scenario planning. We need to plan for multiple scenarios now, given the instability in terms of policy environment. And for companies, because countries can sort of take longer time to negotiate some kind of agreements to mutual benefits, but companies can't really do so much. They still have operating costs they need to handle and so on. But sort of the sense that I get from the conversation with clients is that they are pausing a lot of plans now, be it hiring plan, investment plan. They are pausing at the moment, but there's only so far you can pause. And of course, another trend which you probably seen in the news is that companies they are doing what they call export front loading before the tariff took place, and then the 90 days extension from April to August, and another round of that happening. So they are trying to both handle the short-term sort of the risk impact and the longer term. Longer term will be, you have to ask yourself as a company, how much of the exposure to US, if you have any, that you want to maintain, and then you need to diversify operations, you might need to diversify supply chain, you might need to have a strategy where if US is an important market for you, you might think about having local production or expanding local production. And you can even separate, like the US is one market, rest of the world is another market. So these are the things that I've been hearing from companies thinking of ways how they can mitigate. So for every company, it will be a little bit different, depending on your exposure, depending on the business, the sector you're in.
And maybe perhaps Hsien could share with us how the American companies, MNCs, are looking at Southeast Asia and Singapore in the new tariff environment.
Sure, I can definitely do that, but before I do that, I also want to remind ourselves that we should not make everything before Liberation Day. You know what I'm talking about when I say Liberation Day, right? It's not like everything was perfect before Liberation Day, yeah? There were already tariffs in place across different countries, between countries, before Liberation Day. That is the reason why we have now we all know this term, reciprocal tariffs. So there were challenges like the pandemic beforehand where supply chains were severely disrupted. Companies were already starting to think also of how do they contain costs because they suddenly realized that they've been growing big, and maybe consolidation and mergers and acquisitions weren't the way to go. So even before Liberation Day, what you observed across many MNCs, and some of you, how many of you work for American corporates? Are you willing to admit it? Okay, well, you know what we say, right? Let's face it, American corporates are brutal. They can be very cold-hearted when it comes to restructuring, cost-cutting. So on the American corporate front, even before Liberation Day, all that was already happening. As an example, and this part really affects us in Southeast Asia and Singapore, there were many MNCs who had decided to do the delayering exercise, right? When I first heard that term, I was like, that's just what? Which means that regional roles are being eliminated. And you know it's all cyclical, right? They'll eliminate it, then they'll realize, I really need somebody to coordinate and be like the interface between global and the local markets. You really need someone to pull together a regional strategy, however it's defined. Before Liberation Day, the delayering of regional roles is already happening. The consolidation of regions, as an example, for emerging markets in South Asia to go back to a reporting structure that pushed them into Europe. How annoying is that, huh? That you would have people out here in Asia now reporting to Europe, returning once again to an outside US structure. So that was already happening. So I just don't want all of us to be deluded into thinking things are so much worse before and everything was fantastic. That things are worse now and that things are fantastic before. Life was always going to be challenging, and companies, due to shareholder pressure, was always going to be looking at ways to drive revenue and decrease costs, right? So let's admit that to ourselves. Then in terms of what's happening now with American MNCs, there's still continued investment. And I know I'm being recorded, you're gonna post it on YouTube, but these are factual because in the Singapore press, you will see it reported that certain big American companies are continuing to invest billions of dollars into Singapore. Advanced manufacturing, tourism, innovation centers, moving their Asia headquarters to Singapore, all those things are still happening. You can have senior leaders for really big MNCs talking about continued investment into Southeast Asia. The difference is they may not be as public about it in the US market, right? Those investments are continuing into the region. Singapore is doing really well on that front. You will know about it here locally. If you went into the US, would there be wide media coverage of it with big announcements about it? Not really. So that's the difference. So I don't really think for us here in the region, yes, there's a lot of stress about tariffs and there will be some reorg of supply chains, abandoned shipments, whatever. Overall though, from what I'm hearing from our members is they're weathering it fairly well. Granted that we have not seen the impact of the tariffs play out completely yet because of all these pauses and whatnot. However, most people have continued to invest, and I continue to attend new office openings, innovation center openings, groundbreakings, so it's still, for the most part, very positive.
I think that's what is important now. We are seeing more dynamic scenario, like we drive in the highway. I would say that in the past, 100 kilometers per hour, now you have 800 or 1,000, because you see the changes of the trade and other policies and measures and stuff. So it's unprecedented in terms of the pace. So that means that like you're driving the highway, you have to have the foresight. Because if you wait until the moment you see an area, it's too late. Because you can't, already move much faster than before. And so that's really important to have foresight, as also mentioned, that's related to scenario planning. Yeah. So that's something you have to bear in mind in the course. For example, you probably want to bear in mind the course of reputation. That's something really important long term instead of the short term, profits. So I think that's require foresight, require long term thinking. As even we are facing shorter dynamics, of course, short term response is necessary. And thirdly, I think also important to think about what are the new opportunities, because that means the landscape has been changing, and there will be opportunities, and that depends on who are the more adaptable or agile to deal with that. For lawyers, for example, that means more jobs, opportunities for compliance. Right? You have to comply with that, understand what's happening, or people think about origin planning and so on and so forth. It's more complex. So I think that's who can be more adaptable, and with the foresight will be our leader in that regard.
I think that segues into my next question, in terms of opportunities, because when elephants dance in the grass gets trampled, but even in that environment, the finest fruit is able to thrive and achieve. So what sort of opportunities do you see in the current environment? You mentioned about certain professions and all. Are there other sectoral opportunities that we should pay attention to that have been overlooked in the current present environment?
Maybe just to follow on that, I think there's definitely compliance. It's a very important, increasingly important area because the higher complexity, than before. And also there are many areas, depending on the sector. For example, you think about the payments, think about finance, even those kind of attention, deal with that consolidation, relating to technologies, because you have to think about how do I build my technology value chain, think about my financial payments, value chain, and also thinking about even for educational and other services, think about issue like visa, dynamics you are facing. So I think there are many more happening, particularly, one typical example is a competition, but to help people to move to that direction. That's many examples with the FOMO.
So I would say the opportunities is to focus on the long-term megatrends in Asia, because these are called megatrends for a reason. They don't really change, even despite what's going on on the geopolitical front. So what are the long-term megatrends? You have in Asia, you have things like you still need a lot of infrastructure push, for sure. You also have climate change mitigation, you have energy transition, you have aging population in some parts, especially Northeast Asia, some parts of Southeast Asia. You also have urbanization. So all these trends won't go away over the next 10 or even 20 years. We still require all these things. So these are where the opportunities can come from. It could result in a certain sector that you may be interested in moving towards, certain job function like you like the Prof mentioned, compliance or business development.
Yeah, I'm gonna take a step back because we're sitting in a school of business, so it's very easy to just think business is, but it's, this world is a lot bigger than business. And, I said I'm a public health professional, so I still teach at NUS, by the way. I'm affiliated with both the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health and the one at NUS. And so for me, the world is bigger than business. There is the business of healthcare, there's the business of public health, it's just public health too. So you're really looking for a career. And the other thing is how we keep talking about how AI is disrupting careers and jobs and, what are new fresh graduates going to do? I mean, Wang just spoke about this, right, at the National Day rally. So it's more than just about tariffs. There's unfortunately a lot of things to worry about in this world, and when you think about opportunities, that means you gotta be looking for opportunities in not the usual places. And this is where I'm gonna be a bit self-serving and pitching public health. We have tremendous public health needs in our region, and I'm not gonna talk about the US situation, it's a bit different. Here in Asia, we have very different types of countries. In Singapore, Japan, Korea, we have super aging societies that there are opportunities there to develop technology that will help people, have happier, healthier, more active lives when they get older, right? So aging and then chronic diseases like hypertension, diabetes, all of that stuff. Tremendous opportunity for you to go into the public health service or go into healthcare and find some ways to support people who are going to be living with chronic diseases or living with cancer. So public health is an area that I really want to pitch to you. It's a very human discipline, and there is business aside. But if we just keep talking about tariffs and I'm like, half the world's needs are going to go unmet if we don't start to lift our heads up and think about all of the social needs that we have, all of the healthcare needs they have. So I would encourage you, despite the fact that we're sitting in a school of business, that we connect ourselves with the wider world of need.
I think it's a great question. Actually, there's probably a question common not only to public sector but also to private sector. One thing I'm thinking of, one keyword think of the needs. So what is the need? Either for the market, either for the regional governance and others. I think that's true. To identify the need and to meet the needs will be very important. I think I already mentioned about the panelists just now. So for example, the tariff doesn't mean that we don't have needs. Needs for local needs, regional needs, may not be deep, may not be the same as before. So that's really important. And secondly, I'm thinking of issues that may be more sort of alternatives besides traditional multilateralism, but also regionalism and local markets, because you will still have needs for that. Even if they have changes in that regard. So I think that's local and regional. Besides multilateral, it's all another perspective, the markets or public sector ones. And thirdly, I think it's also about move faster. So you already see the landscape changing. So you want to, even if you have a market in competition, who move faster, think ahead of others, and will be a much more strategic position. And finally, also thinking instead of just respond to that, how do you shape that? So for example, for AI, nowadays not only a buzzword, but also economic, ecosystem. How do you develop new business models or other collaborative measures, including AI security, which have needs for people involved in your sphere. will be also very important. So think about needs, think about local, regional, think about move faster, think about shaping the future.
Well, I hesitate to comment on what Singapore should do simply because I am a foreigner. However, I do think something that, as a foreigner, I'm PR, okay? That's important here, right? that one thing I have appreciated very much about Singapore is that it is a very open country. Open to people, open to ideas, open to different kinds of business, and because of that, it's very diverse. And while that is sometimes not appreciated, and it may not be very appreciated right now in my own country, that is something that Singapore has really got going for it, right? Because, and that's something where I admire the leaders here, where they're determined to help locals understand how important it is for Singapore to stay open in many different ways. In terms of skills, every year the American Chamber of Commerce does a manpower survey. And we survey our member companies on what they're looking for when they're hiring. We also ask them questions like, have you been having issues getting work passes, the typical kind of questions for foreign multinational. The part I find very interesting is, are people graduating, being ready to start jobs? And typically, for the last many years, the multinationals will say that graduates of schools here are not completely ready for the workforce. Right? Not completely ready to have the people skills that are needed to be successful. Technically, I think they are very strong, but it's those, in a foreign, multinational, maybe others can back me up, right? The people skills are really important because you're navigating cultural differences, age differences, and sometimes those kind of skills are not necessarily as easy to learn. And so I always pose the question back to our members then, and well, okay, you see this as a gap, then how do we step in and work with the different schools or work with the fresh graduates who are new to, or interns or whatever, how are we gonna help them develop these kinds of people skills so they can become these regional leaders? And that's something that we've been working on through training and development programs. I do think internships and work study type of programs are really helpful because there's a bit less pressure on both the employer and the intern side. The people skills, I think, are what I would focus on more rather than the technical skills, because those you are going to learn in order to get that job, that what you're going to need to keep that job are the people skills. And I'm gonna push you towards my latest LinkedIn post, which is how to be indispensable. And it is not about your skills, it is not about your capabilities, it is about how you show up at work and how you make your team feel when you walk in through that door and what kind of teammate you are.
Cool. Okay, great.
I would say after working for over 20 years, the number one skills, technical skills is a given if you're a fresh graduate. You need that because if not, you don't have anything else. But I would say number one skills is to have communication skills. You must be able to communicate upwards as well as outwards. Maybe more upwards at the beginning, because I would say that that is when I manage my team. One thing is a lot of them are quite young. Relative to myself. So they do lack communication skills, and maybe it could be because of confidence issue, or it could be they are not sure how to interact with people of different levels, different functions. But at the end of the day, if you are able to master communication skills, it will really bring you a long way.
I say every day I look at the news and I'm so depressed. Because truly the typical ways in which decisions are made and consensus is built in a liberal democracy is not happening. And so it's very disturbing, right, to see that where you see some checks and balances, those are not happening, at least not as apparently as they used to be. We cannot rely on global organizations like WTO. Let's face it, no offense to WTO, but y'all been a mess for a while, right? So that's not gonna happen. Within the United States, at least, I can say that there have been lawsuits against the administration in the form of the fact that President Trump has used IEPA, the Emergency Act, to enact these tariffs, saying that there is a threat to national security. I think those lawsuits are still, winding its way through the courts. In fact, the Chamber is going to get an update from one of our lawyer members on the state of the lawsuits, because they've gone kind of quiet lately. So the legal process may slow things down and de-escalate things. I'm not so optimistic about Congress at the moment, because For us, Congress is currently also majority Republican, and currently the Republican Party is very tightly aligned with President Trump. And that is how democracy works, right? Because the people elected them, these representatives have chosen to be aligned. We do have midterm elections next year. And so some people, historically, you will see some change and shift in the majority. I don't know if that will happen next year. It is up to the de-escalation, in my opinion, it is up to the American people. If they really want to see change, they need to vote. And if they really want to see change, they need to vote and be vocal. And some of that is happening across the United States in the form of protests, which I know Singapore does not like. However, in the United States, those are very accepted forms of voicing your opinion as a citizen. It is probably quieter than it was during President Trump's first term. However, those are ways in which the American people can send a signal that we don't like what's going on. And the third thing would be, which hasn't been happening either, would be through the markets. I think traditionally President Trump has reacted to when the market drops, and however, that's not been happening. The market stayed resilient. Businesses have been doing okay, right? There hasn't really been not a lot of inflation and definitely no recession. So on that front, I don't think there's any course correction going to happen from that corner.
Yeah, I think also being nobody want to be isolated. So I think that's besides these two major economies, also important role for other countries. So how do you have the critical mass, to develop rules, at least in the regional levels, would be one possibility. I think also there's such a large market for other countries. So I think that's role also for the certain countries in that regard, and how to develop, work jointly and define the critical mass and also develop the work life.
I mean, personally, in terms of new mechanism, I'm pessimistic on that front. You had mentioned the ways, and those are existing mechanisms. So I'm not optimistic on that front. Regionalism is one way, sort of like an indirect way, and one of the things when the trade negotiation started after Liberation Day is the ASEAN chair for this year was Malaysia. So Prime Minister Anwar call for unity among the ASEAN nation. But at the end of the day, the individual nation just negotiate on their own, or some of them at least. So you can see it's very hard for that to happen. But that after we have seen some progress in terms of, I think, talks about greater cooperation within region. So that could be one way to mitigate. I won't say it's a like a mechanism to de-escalate, at least not vis-a-vis with the US, but within how we can get more businesses or demand within the region and not from the US.
I think clearly we are seeing the rise of regionalism, countries joining regional platforms like BRICS and all, and ASEAN becomes ever more important. So I think multilateralism is pretty much broken down, deglobalization is happening, and I think we're living in a more fragmented world with the rise of more different blocs all around us.
So as any good economists will always say, if they don't cut, then they may maintain or they may increase the rates. And I'm also more of a corporate economist than a financial market economist. But of course, rate cuts is something that we think about as well, because it entails financing costs for businesses. And at the moment, US financing cost is still pretty high, even with that 100 basis points of cuts so far. And we, at least the company I work for, we still forecast another 1 or 2 rate cuts before the end of the year. But that's not going to move the needle too much. And at the current juncture with some of the FOMC members facing some difficulty, I think Lisa Cook, one of them. So you could see changes in the composition of the board. And if Jay Powell sort of stepped down before his term, or we don't even know who could be the next chairperson, and that could influence the trajectory of the policy into next year. We all know that President Trump wants rate cut. He always calls for rate cut. So that could be well happen. I'm not sure if that's a good thing for your firm, Moderator. I mean, I like that you put quite a bit of faith in Economist, but I would say we don't really have a good track record. So, of course, there are a lot of talk. Even when the tariffs started, right, there was a lot of saying about how inflation in the US is going to shoot through the roof. The headline numbers doesn't show that yet, but if you look inside the CPI numbers, and now we are getting into the weeds of economic data, if you look at the CPI numbers, and there was a study done by somebody at Real LinkedIn, so he break down the data into those components that has a large Chinese import components, and those numbers are going up. So if you take that sense, there is some impact already, because we know that the tariff rate on China is high, right? And we also know that the US administration, they cancelled that, they call it a de minimis $800. So basically anything below $800 used to be tariff free, but now it's no longer the case, which is all maybe your skin, clothing, or things like that, small items. So that maybe is going to show up in the inflation numbers. But again, this is another prediction from Economist. We shall see a few months later whether I'm right or I'm wrong again.
Corporate governance, just had to throw that in there, didn't you? Specifically to the style of deal making and how it impacts investment in the long run, definitely from the manufacturing perspective, there's already been talk and considerations for shifting parts of the supply chain, right? Back to the US. I'm kind of skeptical because it's just too complicated and difficult. You're talking about not just moving a whole, like one plant, you have to move the whole ecosystem, right? You have to move all of the suppliers and it was very complicated. So I actually think it's more likely that these larger companies will just commit to investing more in the US rather than saying cut down their investment in Asia, because at the end of the day, any business leader will tell you that Asia is still a growth engine. You still see double-digit growth in most countries in Asia. Singapore, being a small market and quite well established, we don't use Singapore as a benchmark. The rest of Southeast Asia, India grows like crazy. It's still seen as a huge, the vast majority of the world's population sit between India, excluding China, right? Even excluding India, Indonesia is the 4th largest country in the world. So no company would want to pull out of this region. It's more of a balancing where you are going to allocate investment. We haven't seen a huge decrease. We haven't seen movement out. We have seen more focus on how much more can I put in to the United States. So on that front, so far, companies still remain committed to this region. In terms of like corporate governance and deal making, I don't know about Chinese companies. American companies, despite the fact that President Trump is like, we're not going to enforce FCPA and whatnot, American companies are still trying to do the right thing. They don't care what you call it. You can call it ESG, you can call it DEI, you can call it whatever you want. What is the right thing? Many of the companies continue to do the right thing. They just don't talk about it in the same way.
Because you are seeing more unpredicted scenarios, but also have intended and also unintended effects. That's one example. Those kind of effects spill over to other landscape.
So I think what you're asking is whether this kind of deal making is going to be the norm in the future, and whether Chinese companies going to do it. I think it's very hard to enforce this kind of sort of mechanism, because it's just. I don't think companies will be able to accept it. Maybe on the surface they might say it, because if you look at, let's say, the Apple CEO talking about investing, bringing manufacturing back again, it's a PR campaign for them. But whether they're going to invest in the same amount or not, we are not too sure. And whether, again, uncertainty after beyond Trump's term, is a new president going to adopt the same? Is there going to be another Trump? In my mind, I think there's only one Trump. He has been harping on the same, like the art of the deal. I read his book when I was in the military. I'm not sure why. I thought he was a good salesman, and then I found that it was a ghostwriter who written it. But he has been harping on the same thing since the 80s. Before that, it wasn't China, it was Japan. It's just that at that time, the sort of the population, economic growth is booming and all that, so there wasn't so much discontent. But now it is. So whether they're going to solve this issue or not, I think companies, I would say it's very hard for us to be able to accept this kind of view, take a certain percentage of.
Great. I think we had a very exciting past hour of discussion. I guess some of my, just to reflect and share some of my takeaways. I think broadly the direction is we don't really have a conclusion of how the world is going to look like, despite we try to crystal ball and all. But based on some of the mega trends, I think America, regardless of whoever comes to power, I think there's bipartisan consensus that America needs to continue to want to be number one and to retain dominance. I think that remains a fact. And then China's trajectory is, I think they will continue their peaceful rise. So, I think we are going to be living in a very bifurcated world, or perhaps a more fragmented world. Deglobalization is probably going to continue. There's going to be a rise of regionalism. There's going to be formation of new blocks. So a more fragmented world that we can expect to live in. But I think there's going to be a lot of opportunities if we are able to, have that foresight amidst these uncertainties and complexities. If we're able to spot opportunities, I think that's where you're able to find opportunities for arbitrage and command a premium and make money out of it. So
can I just put in a final plug?
Sure, no problem.
Because I get that sometimes the sentiment against the US, even before President Trump, can be negative. However, I want to remind you that America is a friend to Singapore overall. Okay? America is Singapore's largest source of foreign direct investment, over $420 billion. That's a lot of money. And militarily, the United States has been very much involved in the region. And then the other thing is American companies. Every year, Straits Times publishes top 100 companies that people are happy to work at, and many of them are American companies. And I like to think, I've never worked for any organization, with the exception of my postdoc in Taiwan, I worked for the university. But generally speaking, I like to think American companies are fun, creative, innovative. They look after their employees, even if they have to fire you later. Let's face that. But when you're there, they really have a great environment for you to express yourself. You are taken care of, you're taken seriously. So I just hope that this evening you leave with a little bit of positive impression of Americans and American companies, because just because our country is a certain way right now, that doesn't mean that companies in Singapore that are American, or Americans like me in Singapore, don't want to have, really great relationship with Singapore and Singaporeans. So thank you for hearing me out, and hopefully you will look kindly upon us when you meet us.
Thanks for the plug. I think, back to my point. Singapore remains. You also want to do another OARsome session?
Trade companies are not too bad either.
Well, so I think for Singapore, our position continues to be, we want to remain open, neutral, we are friends to everyone. I think that's where we are able to play that role of being the interlocutor, where we are able to, reach different cultures, reach different partners, and transcend boundaries. I think that's the value add that Singapore can play. And, if we can, prepare ourselves better for that role, being more cross-culturally efficient, I think there's a lot of, growth potential for all of us.